Thanks for joining us. So this class is called North American Regional Scenarios, and we look at U.S., Mexican, and Canadian foreign policy. And I came across your material just recently, and I was glad I came across it because this is the kind of material I like to use in the course. So if you could just start out by quickly telling us your background and your motivation for becoming an activist and your work. What was it that you went to university in Canada? What made you kind of change your perspective?
Well, I went to university. I never finished my degree because I was thrown out of the university. My bachelor's, I was thrown out of university for student activism back about 10 years ago, 12 years ago. But basically, my motivation for getting involved in Canadian foreign policy and being critical of Canadian foreign policy was finding out about what Canada did in the coup in Haiti 10 years ago, where they helped overthrow an elected government, where they supported a dictatorship that was responsible for thousands of people being killed. And Canadians have this self-portrayal of their country's role in the world as being this benevolent force. We just out there to help the world's poor. That's the dominant kind of ideology. And I was a combination of taken aback by what I had learned about what Canada was doing in Haiti, and was appalled by the just the immorality of Canadian policy towards what is one of the poorest parts of the hemisphere. And so I went to look at if they had done such bad things in Haiti, what have they done elsewhere? And I think when you actually look a little deeper, Canadian foreign policy is it's completely self-interested. It's all about advancing corporate interests, and Canada has been there's a portrayal in this country that Canada is sort of bullied by Washington. But in fact, the Canadian elite have been tied into the command and control of world empire going back for more than a century, initially being the British Empire and today being the American Empire. And Canada's elite are very much tied into that, and benefit and profit from the policies that are pursued by the U.S. government. And so, anyways, that's kind of my how I came to start writing about Canadian foreign policy and getting active, specifically around Haiti solidarity. Yeah.
And it's interesting because we have one Canadian here in the class, Mackenzie. They named him after the cat, which was named after the prime minister. Um, but he made a really interesting comment today, and I was wondering if you could repeat it after reading your material. You want to just come up real quick, and then if he's got a question for you.
Okay, yeah. Okay. You can hear me.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. No, I read like the chapter on Middle East recently, in your book, like the Black Book of Canada's Foreign Policy. And yeah, definitely taken back by like all of it. Just read it like yesterday, and it seemed to me like Canada was staging some sort of like nuclear war against the planet, because like I had no idea that like Canada gave nuclear like supplies to India and Israel. And I guess like my main question from the book would be like, does Canada have like an end game on like, are they planning an end game where like they plan on coming out on top from like the end of this, or are they okay just like following the U.S. and like going along with them, or do they have like their own plan where like they see themselves being like one of like the powers by the end of this?
Yeah, I don't think aside from maybe the Caribbean, the English Caribbean, Canada doesn't act in the when I say Canada, we got to be a bit more precise. We're not talking about most Canadians. Most Canadians have almost nothing to do with Canadian foreign policy. I'm talking about Ottawa and the decision makers and the sort of foreign policy establishment. They are, it's tied into U.S. led policy, right? It's not the idea that they're, Canada's in some sort of conflict with the U.S. or the Canadian elite have some sort of end game where they hope to be the dominant power. I don't think that's in the cards, and maybe maybe global warming leads to 90% of the world being covered, and then the north of Canada becomes, or middle, I don't know, somewhere north in Saskatchewan becomes the middle of the universe, and maybe maybe at that point, but yeah, it's tied into the U.S. empire to a large extent.
The second question about global warming.
I actually did have a question, like, because you said, like, at the end of the chapter that, like, they're okay just like supporting U.S. goals so that U.S. gets like control of the resources, but like Canada right now is really trying to like pass that Keystone pipeline, which would see them like reduce like supply from the Middle East by like 40% or something. So like, why would they want the U.S. to have control of the resources if they're like trying to, get the U.S. to start using their oil, like from the tar sands? Because maybe it's more to do with the uranium. They want to like sell uranium to those countries, or I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. To be honest with you, I can't remember exactly what the chapter you're referring to about I wrote that quite a few years ago now. In the case of uranium, it's definitely a desire to sell Canadian uranium. That's the main motivator. In the case of Keystone XL, it's clearly to sell tar sands oil to the U.S. and globally. And then in case of natural, resources globally, I mean, Mexico is a perfect example where Canadian companies completely dominate Mexico's mineral sector, right? It's hundreds of Canadian companies all over the past 20 years. There were basically no Canadian companies operating in Mexico, mining companies operating in Mexico 20 years ago, with all the reforms that came about with, in the lead up to NAFTA and the changes around rules of ownership of mineral resources in Mexico, the sort of neoliberal reforms that have come about. That's the main beneficiaries of that have been Canadian capital, Canadian companies, which completely dominate world mining. 75% of the world's mining companies are based in this country. More than $210 billion in Canadian mining investment abroad. So Canadian capitalists definitely have a major self-interest in opening up the world's natural resources to international exploitation, to foreign investment, to low royalty rates, to having to privatizing state-owned mining companies, et cetera, et cetera. So you got to take each different instance, specifically. In the case of global warming, to take that question, the current government has been just hideous in their opposition to attempts to bring about international agreements on reducing carbon emissions, and the first country to pull out of the Kyoto Protocol, actively lobbying, spending over $100 million in Canadian public money to lobby on behalf of tar sands interests in the U.S., in the European Union, blocking attempts to bring in efforts to bring in things like the low carbon fuel standard in California, or the fuel quality directive in Europe, which is designed to minimize the carbon emissions from different fuel sources. So it's yeah, sorry, it's a roundabout way of kind of going at that, but yeah.
Right, thanks. Yeah.
I guess I have another question. In this course, we focus more on the U.S. Because
what a surprise!
But I mean, I had this preconception. I hadn't deeply investigated Canada until now with some of your work. But I had this preconception that basically Canada did what the U.S. Did pretty much. And then reading some of your work, it filled us in on the details. And can I ask the question: is the military-industrial complex of the U.S. and Canada, are they one and the same? Are they two coins of the same beast? What's your take on that?
They're definitely closely interlinked. The Canadian military, they train with the American military at incredibly high levels. Canadian generals are often working in the U.S. In the Iraq War, which Canada officially didn't join the coalition of the willing that attacked Iraq in 2003, which was a victory, a partial victory of the anti-war movement in this country, and the whole global anti-war movement that sprung up in opposition to that invasion. There was a Canadian general that was at one point in charge of 35,000 international troops in Iraq. Just because he was integrated in the U.S., he was working. He was on a training mission with the U.S. So there's all these Canadian troops that were involved in Iraq because of that. Canadian military companies make large amounts of components of different weapon systems that are that are primarily made in the U.S. and by American military companies. The Canadian military and the U.S. military have literally hundreds of different accords of different kind of agreements of various. The most biggest one being NORAD, the North American sort of defense cooperation, and so yeah, I would say it's the Canadian military industrial complex is very much tied into the U.S. Version, and ideologically tied in also, as well as materially tied in, and is it's unreported. The Canadian government just announced over $10 billion in light armored vehicles to be sent to Saudi Arabia over the next decade. Saudi Arabia being the most repressive, most anti-woman. It's illegal to be. I'm an atheist, so it doesn't bother me that much. But it's illegal to be Christian and have Christian symbols in Saudi Arabia or other religions. I mean, it's an incredibly repressive place, and this passes this huge sale of light armored vehicles to Saudi Arabia, a monarchy that used Canadian light armored vehicles to invade Bahrain and put down the popular pro-democracy demonstrations in Bahrain a couple of years ago. This happens, and there's almost no commentary in the Canadian media. There's literally been no critical in the English Canadian media, no critical comment on this incredible military export to probably the worst regime in the world. And I think that speaks to sort of the power of the military-industrial complex, the power of the idea that it's all about just our corporations benefiting as much, which is obviously something that you see a lot with the U.S. Military industry.
Just to remind students, anyone who's got a question, to come on up. I'm just going to ask another question. If you recall any detail regarding NORAD and U.S. Northern Command, if you recall any other details about like their work together, do they both together cover the whole North American sphere in case of some type of incident? I do recall that they have an agreement where they can both enter each other's borders. Canadian military could come into the U.S. and vice versa. Do you recall any other detail about NORAD or Northern Command?
Yeah, it's been a while since I've read much about NORAD, but yeah, there is a command structure where I think a U.S. general is the top and a Canadian general is number two, and it is a shared command structure that it's and definitely American fighter jets are able to intervene in Canadian airspace and as part of NORAD, but in terms of being particularly detailed explanation in NORAD, I'm not the person for that.
All right, Juan.
Hello, Yves.
Hey.
So my question is, no, I mean, so we've already said that Canada is tied to U.S. interests or agenda mainly, right? But we also know that Canada is a well-established actor in the international sphere. It has stability in democratic terms and a prosperous economy. So in a tentative scenario in which in a medium future term the melting of the Arctic Ocean is coming, right? Or with the access to new technology, there's the possibility in the future to trace new routes in the Arctic Oceans and also to gather new resources. So my question is, how far could Canada go on an individual agenda before the United States spoke out or even put any economic sanction on Canada? Because as it is understood, there are several states that are compromised in the Arctic Ocean, like Iceland, Canada, the US, Russia, Denmark, or Norway. I mean, Greenland, right? So, how far could Canada go in an individual agenda before the US stop Canada or put any economic sanction or any other alternative?
Yeah, I don't think the Canadian government would go that far in terms of pushing the bounds of international law and standards on that. If they felt that the U.S. was uh, going to come down on, if Washington was going to come down, obviously militarily, it's a clear, the situation is pretty clear. But at the same time, I don't see that the U.S. seems particularly hostile to Canada's, what the current Canadian government at least is into in the north, which is opening it up as much as possible to oil exploration, to passageways. There's an article just in today's paper all about the increase in fishing that's going to become available because of Arctic ice melting. Um, um, so the the Arctic question is not one that I've it's a big political issue in this country. It's not one that I've followed that closely, but my sense is that the U.S. is not in there's not a particularly big conflict between Washington and Ottawa on the issue, and it's far down into the future where there would be any sort of conflict or open kind of conflict like that. So. Um,
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else got a question? Come up. Um, really quickly, what do you think about North American integration? For example, we're going to read Robert Pastor's. You're familiar with Dr. Pastor, right?
I'm not.
He's one of the leading proponents of the North American idea to integrate Canada, U.S., and Mexico a la the European Union style. Not exactly, but something like that. And some of the material we read in this class, for example, all kinds of stuff, including, Bilderberg, you've heard of perhaps.
Mm.
There's the 1980 report up on WikiLeaks, where in 1980 they discussed a North American common market or union. And so what's your opinion on this idea of integrating Canada, U.S., and Mexico further, and then issues of sovereignty? What's your take on
Well,
that?
I mean, if integrating means Canada getting rid of visa requirements on Mexicans, I support that. But when they say integrating, what they really mean is they mean integrating capital and building bigger barriers. I mean, it's not a coincidence that alongside NAFTA and you also have this huge wall built along the American Mexican border. I mean, they have a certain definition when they talk about integration. It's not about kids at school in Saskatoon learning Spanish and learning about how the Mexican football team is really terrible. It's about companies being able to play communities, play workers off of each other to get the lowest the lowest wages and have to pay the least amount in taxes, etc. So I'm not a Canadian nationalist, and much of the left in this country are nationalists. But I would take in part at least a sort of nationalist, mostly an internationalist pro working class perspective on things like NAFTA. But I think that the agenda of integration that is popularly pushed in establishment circles is one that's not in the interests of majorities in any of the three countries in North America. And there's a strong correlation between things like the first free trade agreement, the U.S. Canada, then NAFTA, and increases inequality in all the countries, right? All the billionaires in Mexico and the billionaires in this country and the billionaires in the U.S. Have done well by the last couple of decades of opening investment, reducing investment restrictions, increasing companies' ability to move places. I'm not so sure that it's been in the best interests of the environment or the majorities in these different countries.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at some of the cases at the NAFTA tribunal, the Canada, then Canadian people have lost a number of cases to big corporations. I'm sure you're familiar with some of that. Here's another question.
Hi, thank you so much for your time. I have a more general question towards how or what do you think has permitted Canada to be an influential role in world politics and have a active military history without giving up its positive reputation or peaceful reputation it has towards the world and domestically? Like, how are they able to handle that?
It's a good question because I actually think it's fairly impressive the extent to which Canada has been tied into imperial adventures, but then simultaneously generally has a fairly positive image globally. Obviously, internally within Canada, if you leave aside First Nations, which is a big leave aside, we shouldn't be leaving aside that question, but if you leave aside that question, it's quite a prosperous country. The democracy is relative to the states, the democratic situation in most places. It's fairly effective. It's for the past 40 years been a pretty had an official policy of multiculturalism, which is looked at well internationally. There's fairly limited amounts of relative again internationally, fairly limited amounts of racism and other forms of sort of xenophobia that is causes a country's image to be harmed internationally, and even in terms of economic questions, relatively equal, not as equal, of course, as Scandinavian countries, but compared to the U.S. and many of the richer countries, not so bad. So I think it looks for most people looking at Canada, there's a fairly positive sense that comes with that, and there's, I think Canadian decision makers have been quite effective at their packaging of what parts of foreign policy they focus on. Peacekeeping being one historically. Peacekeeping is an idea that I think any sensible person supports in theory as an idea. The idea that if there's two warring factions, that there will be an international force that will step between those two warring factions and minimize conflict. I think that's a very good idea. In practice, how that's actually been used to advance Washington-led geostrategic interests, that's a whole other question. But in principle, it's a good idea. So Canada being at the forefront of something like peacekeeping. In more recent days, something like the responsibility to protect, which is a doctrine that Canadian decision makers were very important in establishing and pushing the idea that basically if there's mass human rights violations taking place somewhere, that the international community will supersede state sovereignty and intervene to stop those human rights violations. Again, it's a principle that on paper is a great principle that I think anybody who's a little bit humanistic will support. In practice, we see in the case of Haiti very concretely, it's used actually to overthrow an elected government and to support an incredible increase in human rights violations. So it really becomes a tool of the powerful. So I think that the Canadian government has been very cognizant of its international reputation and trying to take the lead on initiatives that tend to have certain degree of support internationally. They then try to, for the most part, subvert those ideals to then enable Western U.S.-led geostrategic interests. That's one of the things that you see the current government, the Stephen Harper government. In fact, a big part of the criticism that you hear of the Harper government in the dominant media in this country is that it's turning his back on that element of Canadian foreign policy history, things like the responsibility to protect, things like peacekeeping, and so it's sort of like the criticism is not a criticism at a moral level, but is a criticism at the level of, strategically for the long-term interests of Canada's foreign policy, we're better off having a sort of softer edge and taking on these certain types of initiatives that in fact will be better for Canada's foreign policy, which is another way usually of saying sort of Western-led interests or geostrategic interests. To be honest with you, I don't have a. That's a question, a variation of that question I've heard lots of time. I don't have a full explanation of that. The other component to it would be that the reality of the nation state system is that most countries' foreign policies don't look very good. They're very self-interested. They're generally in the hands of the wealthy. My guess is, Mexican foreign policy, it's 90% of Mexicans have almost nothing to do with, have almost no influence over Mexican foreign policy. I don't know the issue that well. There's only, there's a very rare examples of really, sort of really non-interested, or what's the word I'm looking for, a disinterested foreign policy and benevolent foreign policies. There's some examples I think you can see where, for instance, Cuba in ending racism in Southern Africa, and Cuba consciously sending black troops to fight in Angola against the apartheid regime, and that was done to minimize the fact that Cuba was even known to be involved, and sending black troops specifically to undermine ideas of white supremacy and stuff that were obviously pushed by the apartheid regime in South Africa. But for the most part, most nation states have been it's the people who determine foreign policy is not it's the area where the elite tend to have the most control over social policy, and they obviously orient that to serve their interests.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hey.
So you said earlier, I think that you talked about English speaking media in Canada. So that got me thinking. So let's say that tomorrow there's a referendum announced in Canada, and on Friday they have this big vote, and by Monday Quebec is an independent country. Where do you think that Quebec would stand as far as its foreign policy? Would they be like Canada's younger like BFF still, or would there be like this huge resentment and they would hate each other forever, and maybe they'd go party with French or the Russians or whatever? So,
well, the dominant sphere of the sovereigntist movement in Quebec has made it clear that they would stay in NAFTA for sure, but also stay in NATO. Has made it clear that their vision of independence is really basically just a linguistic question, and when it comes to economic questions, there was a time when the sovereigntist movement was much more socially oriented and was a reaction to the English capitalists that dominated in Quebec and particularly in Montreal. But that's to a certain extent that's just history at this point. So I think Quebec, an independent Quebec would likely be tied into a Canadian-U.S. foreign policy. One of the sort of ironies actually about NAFTA and or particularly the first free trade agreement that Canada signed with the U.S. in 1989. The union movement in Quebec, which is stronger than the labor movements in English Canada, had actually took a sort of ambivalent position because it's quite sovereigntist in orientation, the labor movement. So they took a fairly sympathetic position towards the free trade agreement with the U.S. because it was a way of weakening sort of Canadian, weakening federalism. That's how it was perceived. I think that in hindsight, the labor movement would wish it didn't take that position, and they see that what was happened with this process is that working people have been harmed by things like the FTA and NAFTA, but I don't see independent Quebec as being, obviously there's a component of the sovereigntist movement that is, or just Quebec in general obviously has a closer ties with France than the rest of the country. There's lots of French media you see in Quebec. And there's some positive elements of Quebec. The main reason Canada didn't join the coalition of the willing in 2003 in invading Iraq was not just the anti-war movement across the country, was specifically the anti-war movement in Montreal and in Quebec. And anti-war sentiment was much stronger in Quebec. There's a much stronger pacifist kind of tendency in Quebec. And so it was really the demonstrations in Montreal, which got up to like 200,000 plus people, that helped keep Canada out of the war, which was, I think, in my opinion, a very positive thing. Also on questions like Palestine, Quebecers tend to be much more sympathetic to Palestinians than English Canada, which is partly tied into the fact that you get much more French media, which covers the issue in a more sympathetic way than does the English Canadian media, which is more dependent upon the U.S. Associated Press and other kind of U.S. media outlets. So Quebecers are definitely more internationalist and more sympathetic to sort of national liberation struggles. There's a certainly back in the 70s that was the case, I think. But at this point, I think that Quebec, the dominant trend in Quebec sovereigntist movement is one of very much pro-capitalist, pro-Western kind of vision.
Just a few final questions to finish up, unless anyone else has another question. We had a question from our fellow Canadian about Pierre Trudeau, who criticized the '82 invasion of Palestine. His son Justin Trudeau says was elected prime minister in the next election, or he's a forerunner. And would you think the bias would stay the same? What do you think his position would be?
Pierre Trudeau criticized the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and that is probably one of the most principled instances of Canada's ties to Israel. The historic, I think that's an instance where Canada, I would have gone much further. I think the government should have gone much further in breaking off diplomatic relations and being more aggressive towards Israel after the invasion. But it is an instance where there was, I think, some genuine criticism, and a decent position was taken by the government, the Canadian government. The Harper government has pushed the spectrum in terms of pro-Israel policy so far to the right over the past 7 years that what you have happening is you have the Liberal government, Liberal Party, and the NDP just trying to keep up. Recently, a couple months ago, the lead, one of the Bronfmans, which is one of the most historically influential Canadian capitalists, Jewish Canadian capitalists in Montreal. One of the Bronfmans became the head of the fundraising for the Liberal Party, and actually criticized Harper, criticized the current government, saying that Justin Trudeau had already been to Israel, whereas Stephen Harper hadn't. Obviously, some people might have seen this. Maybe you haven't seen this, but it's probably not big news in Mexico. But it was big news in Canada just a couple of weeks ago. Stephen Harper made a trip to Israel, and so undermined that argument. But the point being is that the Liberals of Justin Trudeau were actually trying to sort of say we're even more pro-Israel than Stephen Harper. So that doesn't bode well for what they will do when they take office. And the reality is that the Thomas Mulcair's NDP, as right now is the official opposition, but the historic Social Democratic Party, I guess akin to the PRD, that they are also taking this very pro-Israel kind of policy and basically refusing to criticize Israel's ongoing settlement building, Israel's aggressiveness in the region. So it doesn't look very promising right now for a more justice-oriented policy on the question of Palestine. I don't know. I assume the movement in Mexico is probably, it's a very different dynamic than in Canada. But alongside this extremely pro-Israel policy on Palestine, you have growing numbers of activists and social movements that are taking up the question of solidarity with the Palestinians and pursuing the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign. So you have increasingly pro-Israel policy at the official level, but you have increasing knowledge and activism in support of Palestinian rights at the sort of grassroots level. The grassroots is still very far from being able to determine government policy, but I think it's building in a way that suggests that it's going to get harder and harder for governments not to heed the calls of the grassroots on that question. That might be 20, 30 years from now. Hopefully it won't be. Hopefully it's a year or two, or short term for Palestinians' sake. Yeah, so I would doubt that Justin Trudeau is going to be much better on that question.
And if I'm not mistaken, Harper on his trip saying "Hey Jude" to Netanyahu, right? We watched that in class.
Yeah, which is the choice of song is even a very yeah. Anyways, but
really quickly, your crystal ball. What's the future for Canadian foreign policy? Is it generally continues along the lines of Washington's little brother, or will we see much divergence?
I think that short to medium term, it doesn't look good. I mean, one of the things points I make in my most recent book called "The Ugly Canadian: Stephen Harper's Foreign Policy," is that there's two main. Canada's always been tied into from the British Empire, then after World War II, and the U.S. Empire has been very much tied into the command and control of world empire for last century at least. But what you have going on economically in this country, I think, is going to lead to even more aggressive foreign policies going forward, because you have a situation where there's two main driving forces that are pushing it even a more rightward direction, which is the tar sands, which is an immense source of potential and current profits for lots of companies. Most countries that have significant oil reserves have national oil companies. Unfortunately, Mexico is going in the wrong direction on that. But most countries that have significant oil, so there's limited places where the global multinational oil companies have to invest to access new reserves. Canada and the tar sands is one of the main ones. So there is an incredible amount of money to be made there, and it's also some of the dirtiest oil that's available. And obviously, with environmental concerns, there are, anybody who is sensible in this world doesn't just want to keep, wants to keep the vast majority of oil that is the known reserves in the ground. I mean, otherwise we're walking down the path of serious problems for humanity that we really don't fully understand. The tar sands being some of the dirtiest, this should be the first stuff that's kept in the ground. That's leading the Canadian government to increasingly aggressive positions and lobbying in the U.S. and the European Union against international climate negotiations. I think it spills over to the point of just being hostile to the United Nations, because if you're anti UN climate negotiation meetings, which the current government is incredibly hostile to. I think it just leads to a generally anti-UN position, which is, sort of a rightward shift. Likewise, the rise of Canadian mining companies that have really gone, just exploded in the past 25, 30 years. In the case of Africa, there was less than $250 million in Canadian mining investment in Africa in 1989. As of 2011, there was $31 billion in Canadian mining investment. Likewise, as I mentioned, Mexico is a perfect example of just an explosion of Canadian mining investment. In all of those cases, that is intimately connected to the rise of neoliberal capitalist policies. When there were state-run mining companies, obviously, or there was restrictions on foreign investment in the mining sector and natural resource sector, that's obviously terrible for Canadian mining companies. So Canadian mining companies are completely petrified by movements that challenge neoliberal capitalism, because one of the first things they tend to call for a community or a country's natural resources to be in the hands of public entities. And so, they're totally freaked out. You have Peter Monk, who is the head of Barrick Gold, which was the biggest gold company in the world, a Toronto-based company. Even though his company had no investments in Venezuela, totally freaked out by the moves taking place in Venezuela, because he rightly understood that if Venezuela moves down a path of more nationalization of its natural resource sector, then that starts spilling over. Next thing you know, Brazil and Peru and other countries are going to start going in that direction. So the Canadian mining industry is completely dependent upon an open, low royalty rate mining scene. And to maintain that, I think it demands an interventionist-oriented policy that I think leads to sort of a more aggressive Canadian foreign policy. So you have the long history of Canada's elite being tied into the U.S. empire, and then on top of that, you have the rise of the tar sands, the rise of Canadian mining investment globally. Those two forces are just further pushing Canadian foreign policy in a rightward direction, which is doesn't bode well for the future, the short-term future. Alongside that, I think that the flip side to that is that Canadians are more internationalist, less racist, more aware of what's going on in the world today than they've ever been before, right? So there's a consciousness about what's going on in the world, and so the first step always with being being opposed or being able to be to bring a critical voice to Canadian foreign policy is for people to be aware of what's going on. So there's growing awareness. There's growing interest, there's growing, I think, care for what goes on around the world. It's at this point, it's far from having enough strength to determine Canadian foreign policy, but there is this growth of consciousness about what Canada's doing globally. We can just hope that it leads to changes in policy.
I'm glad they're much more involved up north, because a survey last week said that 1 in 4 Americans believe the sun revolves around the earth. So I'm not sure if you caught that. Do you have any authors you might recommend to read more about Canadian foreign policy or politics? Any authors you like that you think we should check out?
Well, in terms of like online, people like Derek O'Keefe. Not books, but lots of articles. Anthony Fenton, who I co-authored a book with. There's actually there's a book called in French. There's a couple of books in French that are very good. One of them has been translated into English called Imperial Canada. Alain Deneau. He has a book in French called Noir Canada, Black Canada, which is all about Canada's role in Africa, the Canadian company's negative role in Africa. There's a very good in the back of the Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy. I have a list of the 20 what I consider the 20 best books on Canadian foreign policy. It's 15 or 20, I forget the number. There's a few there. There's a very good book about Canada's historic ties to in Central America, which I'm forgetting the name of it right now, that I mentioned in the back there. Yeah, I can think about it more and send you an email on it.
Okay. And finally, any advice for the next generation students? Advice you can give them? They're all international relations majors. So, words of wisdom.
I don't know in terms of words of wisdom. I mean, I think the one thing is I personally find it very it's enjoyable to be involved in political activism. It's life affirming to be engaged, and if you have the privilege of taking the time to learn about world affairs. There is also, to some extent, a responsibility that comes with that, and the vast majority of people in the world don't have the luxury or the time or the privilege, if you like, to pay attention to these things, to have the time to study these things. There is a certain responsibility that comes with that, and there is unfortunately there is a lot of injustice in this world. I think we as humanity can do a lot better. There's some big issues, obviously the climate one being the overriding one that are quite ominous for world affairs and where humanity is going. Yeah, I mean, I personally have found being engaged in political activity, certainly when I was at university. I mean, it ultimately got me thrown out of the university, but it was some of the most enjoyable times I've had in my life of being involved in student politics and international solidarity activism, and I know that there's lots of important issues on the table that people should try to get engaged with.
We'll see how long I last interviewing people like you and talking about these kinds of topics from a politically incorrect perspective. Well, and finally, any other books you're coming out with, or any interests you have right now, or anything you're working on?
I'm working on a book about Canada's role in Africa, tentatively titled "How Canada Underdevelops Africa," and just going over the history from Canada's ties to the slave trade to the pre-colonial period and the sort of quote unquote exploration of Africa by Europeans in the late 1800s to the colonial phase, and then a lot with the current day in terms of the Canadian mining companies and other policies that are in my view not in the interests of the majority of population, and to serve corporate interests. And there's a real lack of, and this includes myself. I've paid a lot more attention to Latin American politics, which to a certain extent over the past 15 years have been pretty lively and in some instances quite positive in terms of developments. But I think I'm incredibly ignorant about what's gone on in Africa and what's going on politically in Africa, and I'm just trying to add a little clarity. I will also to learn a bit myself, but add a little clarity to trying to understand why so many people are so impoverished there. And Canada has not played a huge role in that impoverishment, but has played a small role that I think should be better understood.
Okay, well, thank you a lot here from Mexico for taking the time to talk to us. Really enjoyed your work, and I'm going to look out for that new book and keep up to date with your writings on your website. So thanks a lot from Mexico.
Thanks. Thank you.
Have a good night.
You too. Bye.